I've written this book. It's about a Secretary of State who is definitely not me, trying to fix the United States of America after the previous evil president Donald Trump, Eric Dunn, ruined everything. But then a terrorist plot is revealed, so Ellen, has to use her super politician powers to save her country from the Russian mafia and the jihadists.
Sounds great! You just need a real author to slap the name on the front to trick people into taking it seriously.
What about James Patterson?
Nah, he's still working with Dolly Parton. But don't worry, I got someone else in mind.
You may remember it in my Blue Bloods review. I spoke of a book I've been struggling to get through. This is that book. Yes, I've finally finished it. It may have taken me 7 weeks, but I did it. I may have lost several brain cells along the way, but I did it. State of Terror by Hillary Rodham Clinton and Louise Penny is a political thriller following Ellen Adams, the newly appointed Secretary of State under President Douglas Williams, a surprise as she had openly backed his opponent during the election. Something he hasn't forgotten, as he seeks to belittle and criticise her at every opportunity. However, when various European cities fall victim to a series of bombs, she is thrown into a terrorist plot on a scale never known before. Not only are hundreds and thousands of lives at stake, but it could spell the destruction of the entire USA. You may remember how Bill Clinton's book was just a thinly veiled power fantasy with a transparent self-insert just to make himself feel cool and relevant. Like husband, like wife. As you've probably worked out, it is your typical American political thriller where the good, honest, salt-of-the-earth politicians and their select favourites battle evil politicians with opposing views and terrorists from the Middle East to save freedom and democracy. When I started reading, I did have a notebook to scribble down thoughts, but I gave up after just over 100 pages. It may mean I have to be less specific in this review, but if I hadn't, I would still be reading the book now. So apologies for any vague comments or disjointed thoughts, but I couldn't do it. I also had a brief look at the reviews on Goodreads, just out of interest, and honestly was really surprised at how high the rating is, and the sheer number of 5-star reviews this book has, despite it being, well, not great. A lot of people giving it 5-star reviews do comment on the trolls giving it 1 star despite not reading the book just because they don't like Hillary Clinton. In fact, going through less than half of the 5-star reviews yielded at least 2 people whose reviews are nothing to do with the book itself, and at least 6 people who rounded up 3 stars or fewer to 5 just because of these trolls. I also looked at the 1-star reviews, and guess how many I found were from people who explicitly hadn't read the book and were just trolling? 1! Maybe there were more before and they got deleted, or maybe a couple of people read this review, misinterpreted it as representative of all 1-star reviews, mentioned it in their own review, which other people read and took as truth. I don't know. I don't care. What I do know is that the people giving this 5 stars were clearly reading a different book. That, or they were just giving Hillary a little too much slack just because of who she is. I think if someone else had written this, it wouldn't have been so well received. But, you know, this is Saint Hillary, who nearly became the first female president of the US, so she must be a god. Personally, I've never really understood the blind hero worship of her. Then again, we in Britain had a female prime minister decades before the US had a major party female candidate, and she was rubbish. Lots of people hate her, but I'm sure there are others who think she was amazing just because she was a woman, and that's what's happened to Hillary Clinton. Politics, where your gender is more important than your agenda. When the actual exciting part of the plot got going, it was passable. You know, when there was a more concrete line of action to follow. Occasionally there was a description or turn of phrase I liked, very occasionally. And there was a fable mentioned in the second half I quite enjoyed, which was then referenced in the narration, which I thought was quite clever. That's about it. This book really isn't well written. The first thing I wrote down in my notebook of thoughts was, reads like fan fiction. Now, I read a lot of fan fiction in my formative years, so much that I'm not really quite sure how to explain why it feels like fan fiction. It just does. Reading it just transports me back to my 14-year-old self, consuming chapters upon chapters of unpolished, messy, self-serving prose written by other 14-year-olds. I don't have a problem with fan fiction. It was an important part of my life, and I wouldn't be who I am now without it, but one would expect published books to be of better quality than teenagers without professional editors. I think maybe it was the cliche opening with our main character Hillary I mean Ellen, running down a corridor, late for an important meeting, and asking her stick in the mud chief of staff if she looked alright as she was, distinctly dishevelled and splattered with manure. I'd also written down tropes galore, because no one in this book feels like a real person, but it said 2D cutouts of the good guys and the bad guys of politics. The only character that feels not nuanced, but more nuanced than the others is President Douglas Williams, and that's only because he's presented as a petty, incapable idiot, but by the end is decent. But even then, that's only because he finally starts to listen to Hillary. I mean Ellen. That typical problem of short one-line paragraphs that are meant to create a sense of tension, but when you use them several times a page, it just makes the pacing really choppy and makes reading this an absolute chore. Dialogue is overdramatic and very convoluted, lots of long conversations with no or few dialogue tags, so I forget who's talking. So many pointless bits that could and should have been cut out. When it's not being overdramatic or convoluted, it's trying to be funny, but failing miserably because it's just really cringy. Like Ellen using her media empire to make fun of the president by having people make up anagrams of his name. Hilarious. The running joke of Ellen and Betsy, who's her best friend, using a grammatical term walked into a bar is tedious and serves as one of the many ways Hillary Clinton tried to convince the reader she's incredibly clever and witty, but really comes across as condescending and arrogant. This is further extended with the constant references to literature and poetry, characters, plural, randomly quote famous passages, and it is so annoying and forced and cringy. There's also a fair amount of swearing. That's not a problem in and of itself, but somehow it doesn't sound genuine in this. It doesn't read as characters swearing because that's what they would do, but Hillary trying to show us she's down with the kids and can speak like real humans, which obviously has the exact opposite effect.
I'm trying to figure out how we get them to have Pokemon go to the polls.
Somebody help! I've been kidnapped by a politician trying to relate to me.
The description is pretty bland throughout, very little sense of place, very little sense of atmosphere. For all the effort this book puts into making us understand the suspense of the situation, I never really felt it. Again, because it uses the short, quick sentences and single-line paragraphs so often, it loses effectiveness for the scenes where they might be apt. It's like adding a pinch of salt to a lovely homemade salted caramel creme brulee, but after 5 courses of hideously oversalted food, that salted caramel is not going to taste delicious. The order of events and the way scenes are put together is really annoying. The opening alone has this strange cyclic structure wherein we start with Ellen, late for this meeting, then go back to her on the plane and follow the scene all the way back to the beginning. It just feels a little strange, like the book forgot how it started. I made the exact same comment about something at the end of the book, but honestly I can't remember what specifically it was about anymore. Just know that this book seems to have short-term memory loss. There are other parts where we get really tiny scenes, like a paragraph long, as text messages are sent from character to character, or for some reason we'll randomly jump to Betsy in a car and she'll look out the window, and then we'll go back to other characters. It's just these breaks in flow for no real reason, like full-on scene hopping for no discernible effect other than to make me want to throw this book out of a window. Also head hopping. So much head hopping. So much clumsy head hopping. The characters are pretty dull. Ellen Adams, as you've probably realised, is just Hillary Clinton doing cool, important stuff. It's so transparent, it's actually painful.
On page 72, Temperance's name changes to Marge for 3 paragraphs.
She's so humble and doesn't care about her appearance at all, apart from regularly dyeing her hair. She turns up to a meeting in the first chapter covered in manure because she didn't wear protective clothing at a fertilizer plant in South Korea and didn't bother changing her clothes at any point on her journey back to DC. But it's alright because her dishevelled state only seemed to add to her dignity. Some call it working hard and getting down and dirty. Others call it disrespectful and an inability to manage one's time effectively, which should be a prerequisite for a member of the government cabinet. Betsy is the quirky best friend who's snarky and oh so funny, and swears like a sailor, and everyone just loves her spunk. Then there are a host of other characters whose personalities are... Bashir Shah, the terrorist weapons supplier fence guy, is just every other smart evil guy ever and is clearly meant to be the Lex Luthor to Ellen's Superman, the Joker to her Batman, the Moriarty to her Sherlock. He is her nemesis. He is determined to mess with her, in particular because she's the only one who's ever bested him, as it was her media empire's documentary that got him put under house arrest. And even now, the only time he's ever worried is when she does something he doesn't expect, because she's the only person who could ever outsmart him. See, she's just that intelligent and important and clever and good at her job and really should be president. Here is the description of the British Prime Minister from page 31. A hollow man, an upper-class twit, with any guts he might have had replaced by entitlement and random Latin phrases. Jack Sumburger is such an obvious caricature of Boris Johnson, it isn't even funny. And Eric Dunn, the ex-president who messed up everything during his presidency, whose self-imposed nickname is The Dun, who allowed the release of this dangerous terrorist because he was too thick to understand what he was doing, who retired to his palatial estate with golden gates and still thinks of himself as president. No prizes for guessing who he's meant to be. He actually says fake news at one point, and I nearly died. And everyone else just feels cartoonish. Either a misunderstood good guy or an evil person who hates Ellen. Democracy. The evil forces manages to include not just the terrorist guy, but also the Russian mafia, including the evil short president of Russia, who definitely doesn't remind me of anyone, and an alt-right conspiracy group with a secret online presence. And overall, I just struggled to remember who was who half the time, which is not good. It's a pretty insane plot. It feels a bit over the top. Then again, I'm not a politician, so maybe it's startlingly realistic. It is certainly a chore to follow through, with lots of people making idiotic decisions. People go here, there and everywhere, jetting to and from Iran and Pakistan and Russia. There are secret villains who aren't secret villains but actually are secret villains. Maybe the plot is actually alright underneath the bloated writing, but I couldn't tell you what happened between page 50 and page 300. The opening was relevant-ish, and the last 200 pages felt relevant. But the middle, goodness knows what was going on. I couldn't follow it. Then again, I did end up skimming sections because I was so sick of the writing style. I figured if I missed anything important, I'd be able to work it out later. The US's involvement with the initial plot, which is about these bombs going off in European buses, felt quite forced. I just didn't buy the UK Prime Minister immediately going to the American President for help over this one bus bomb, when at that point there wasn't anything to suggest it was going to attack anywhere else. Like the 7/7 attacks, you'd assume they'd all be in the same city. I guess it was just an excuse for Ellen, to show off her cultured side and her amazing knowledge of London, which apparently is better than the UK Prime Minister's. When the second bomb goes off in Paris, then maybe it would make more sense for the US to go on high alert because it might be them next. I thought the way the mystery unravelled was quite messy, with lots of information being kept from the reader on purpose for shock reveals, but really just left me kind of confused. And I just honestly didn't care. The plot was so massive, nuclear bombs in the USA waiting to go off, that I never actually believed the country was in danger of exploding. But the main problem really is that this book just did not hold my interest. Like I said, it took nearly 7 weeks to read it. I'd read for ages, feeling like I'd gotten through at least 100 pages, only to find I'd barely covered 20. And failure to hold my interest for what should be a fast-paced action thriller is a failure of the book's fundamental purpose, to be a medium of entertainment. Even the stupid vampire book kept my interest better, and barely anything happened in that. This one is just so up itself that I didn't want to continue. And now for the random stuff that annoyed me. Why is this book so damn obsessed with America? There is a meeting about the bus bombs. A character called Anahita realises what the cryptic message she had received earlier means and forces her way into this meeting to deliver a message to her boss. For some reason, instead of telling him when the next attack is going to be, she gives him a piece of paper. Her boss doesn't even bother reading it. Did you not think that maybe, just maybe, if she bothered sneaking into this meeting to give it to him, it might be really important? So she then sneaks back into the meeting a few minutes later. So what was the point of the written message? To make the boss look thick? All men in this, by the way, are super thick. Girl power. Like most women, unlike the myth, she was good in a crisis. Funny, I didn't think that was a particularly gendered trait. More of an individual thing. I've got an idea. Instead of trying to show women are great by making them all out to be super strong, powerful, level-headed, intelligent, practically perfect in every way gods, why don't we just write women as people? We were allowed to have flaws and not be looked down for it. Apart from Canada, St. Ellen is allowed to look down on the official from Canada for not wearing makeup and having terrible dress sense because she's wearing a silly dressing gown at 2 a.m. A dressing gown with moose and bears. You know, because she's Canadian. What was a Frenchman wearing? A baguette pyjamas? By the way, she doesn't mention about the men not wearing makeup, which I think is very misogynistic. I think this book briefly forgot how many time zones there are in America. It also briefly forgot how to count. 30 rangers plus 6 special ops crew equals 34. No way buses are still running as usual after 2 capital cities are hit with bus bombs. Somehow one of the top government politics people, a chief of staff, has never heard of this crazy famous terrorist about whom his boss has made a full-on documentary. I think I know why this government got so easily infiltrated by the evil guys. Apparently in this world, a nuclear physicist isn't allowed to catch a bus without the government knowing.
Can't even go to a bookshop without making the front page.
Hillary makes out the world of politics to be cutthroat and harsh and cruel, but every now and again forgets his interpretation to give us saccharine scenes about the importance of making friends, which is tonally confusing. Occasionally, this book forgets how paragraphs work. It's all right, Madam Secretary. He still sounded sleepy, but was gaining strength with each word. How's your son? It was the question a man who'd lost too many young men and women would think to ask. Yes, because only people who have suffered loss would think to ask after their friend's son, who was in hospital after being nearly blown up by a bomb. I am so glad I finished this book. Do I recommend it? For the bin, maybe, but for reading, no. It's far too bloated, too convoluted, and too far up its own red, white and blue backside to actually be entertaining. And this is the last time I let Alex pick a book for me.
That's fair.
Well, I finished that collaboration with Dolly Parton. What's next? That political thriller with Hillary Clinton?
She's already published that with Louise Penny. But I do have something else for you. A military conspiracy about a volcano with Michael Crichton.
Didn't he die?
He already wrote most of it. You just need to finish it off.
I'm in.